A stone ledger was opened in Utah last winter, its last page already signed by someone still breathing. That's how this began, not with a shout, but with the cold whisper of something unfinished. A child's lullaby hummed backward in a barn where no child had lived for 70 years, and on a hill above Sevier County, a single candle burned without melting, seen only once, but described by 3. You weren't meant to hear this story. That's what makes it powerful. Because what you're about to learn is not history as it was taught, it's history as it was hidden. The Danites weren't just a group of angry settlers, they were a fracture in the American soul. And like all fractures, they spread in silence before they cracked the world open. Far West, Missouri, 1838. The air was already fractured before the first oath was whispered. Mormon settlers driven from county to county had carved a fragile peace in Caldwell County, but peace has a sound, and that sound had gone missing. Neighbors stopped speaking in full sentences. Horses refused to drink at certain creeks. Even the wind seemed to pause near the northern groves. In that pause, something grew, unseen, unnamed, and unstoppable. The official story says the Danites were merely a vigilante band, born to defend their community during the Mormon War. That's what the textbooks say. But men who were there spoke differently when they dared to speak at all. They said it wasn't about defense, it was about transformation. That 12 men went into the northern woods on a night without moonlight, carrying nothing but flint, knives, and a book with no spine. They said those 12 never truly came back. One of them, a man named Jotham Carter, wrote to an elder in Ohio that the fire touched each brow and did not burn, and the words were cut beneath the tongue. Days later, he was found dead by Shore Creek, clutching a stone engraved, with an inverted sickle over an open eye. They buried him without a sermon, and when the preacher tried to speak, his voice collapsed to a whisper. The newspapers called it superstition, the locals called it a warning. Understand this, the Danites did not recruit, they revealed. They sought out the men who had already begun to rot inward from grief and rage, and they gave that rot a purpose. They promised not victory, but erasure. They were not soldiers, they were instruments. An oath was made, passed mouth to mouth in a whisper too low to echo. Loyalty without question, vengeance without hesitation, silence until death. It worked. Men who had been gentle farmers began appearing at night on ridgelines, watching silently as barns collapsed and wells filled with black water. Anti-Mormon agitators drowned in their own cellars, though no water had been drawn in weeks. Governor Boggs received anonymous letters. The vineyard defends itself. The plowshare turns. We are 13. We do not forgive. And still, the most disturbing part wasn't the deaths. It was the vanishings. Names disappeared from county ledgers. Families who swore they had 7 children woke up with only 5, and no memory of the missing. Surveyor William Langston recorded a strange cabin beyond Upper Creek Bend that appeared on no map. His handwriting changed mid-ledger when he described it, smaller, tilted, frantic. He wrote of light seen from the floorboards. That was the last line he ever wrote. They found his mule tied to a tree, untouched. No struggle, no blood, just ash spiraling in the grass as if scattered from above. The town said nothing. By then, Far West was already crumbling under siege, but decades later, a folded map arrived at the Missouri Historical Society with Langston's script showing the cabin marked with a red slash and one sentence on the back. She speaks when no one listens. Understand what that means. There are places where the earth remembers things too deeply to allow change, where silence itself becomes a structure. The Danites understood this, or were consumed by it, because what they created was not an army. It was a wound, a sacred wound, and America never closed it. You see, this was never about Missouri. It was about the architecture of obedience, about how faith can be sharpened until it cuts through reality itself. And once you know this, once you see the shadow of the Danites moving through the soil of history, you can't unsee it. This is the threshold. Past here, there's no coming back the same. If you're still with me, breathe slowly, because the further we go, the less the world will sound the way it did before. The first snow came early that year, a thin crust over the Missouri soil, just enough to mute the sound of boots. It was during that unnatural quiet that Sheriff Ullman Peake was called to investigate an abandoned homestead northeast of Gallatin. The family had fled after the August skirmishes, their windows left yawning open, doors swinging like loose teeth. Neighbors whispered of flickering light inside at night, though no one dared approach. Peake was not a man given to fear, Presbyterian, methodical, a believer in ledgers and locks, but in his journal entry of November the 2nd, 1838, he wrote, "Found house undisturbed, yet something hangs in the air like milk gone sour. Saw boot scuffs in the dust that lead in but not out, and the fireplace smells wrong, not of wood. Something sweeter and wet." It was what he found behind the hearth that shattered him, a concealed cavity carved into a support beam no wider than a man's arm. Inside was a small leather-bound ledger wrapped in cloth, tied with a fraying cord. The cover bore no title, only a sigil, a three-pointed star beneath an inverted arch. That mark would later appear faintly etched into the door of a meeting house in Nauvoo, Illinois. But in 1838, Peake had never seen it. He carried the ledger to the fire, braced it across his knees, and opened it. What struck him first was the silence. Not in the room, the air itself still shifted, but in his mind. His thoughts slowed, stretched thin like cooling tallow. Words no longer sounded like words, they rang through his body like struck bone. The pages were filled with names, no dates, no places, just names. He recognized none, and yet each name felt carved into the marrow of him. He tried to speak them aloud, but his voice faltered, collapsing to breath. His vocal cords seemed to reject the shapes, and as he stared, the ink began to vanish, not fading but collapsing inward, letter by letter, as though the words had grown tired of being seen. Within a minute, the book was blank. Every page except one. The final page bore a single line scrawled in a hand unlike the rest. "It is not that they were forgotten, it is that they were never written properly." Peake closed the book, trembling. He rode back to town without reporting what he'd seen. For 2 days he did not speak. When he finally confessed to Reverend Myron Elwell, the preacher noted that Peake was not afraid of the names, only the silence they produced. "I looked at them and felt them behind me," he said. "Not in the room, behind the me I thought I was." That night, Peake built a fire from old fence posts behind the church and burned the ledger. The flames gave off no smoke. The paper collar was inward like a lung deflating. By dawn, nothing remained but pale residue, slick as boiled bone. The following morning, the ground where the book had burned had turned black and refused to hold frost. Children walking past claimed to hear whispers under their boots. Elwell resigned his post within a week, leaving only a single sermon draft behind, ending mid-sentence. "The saints have gone to ground, but the ground still breathes." Do you see what this means? This was not rebellion. It was erasure. The Danites were not simply killing men, they were removing them from narrative itself. Every human civilization is built on continuity, on names and dates and the illusion of sequence. But the Danites found something older, something primal, that if enough silence is woven around a life, it dissolves. They called it binding the gap. And once a name was bound, it stopped belonging to history. Even now, researchers examining the few surviving letters are struck less by what they reveal than by what they omit. Letters written in perfect script will skip a name without space, as if the hand could not remember it existed. Ledgers from 1839 in Daviess County show ink trails where names should be, like ghosts refusing the paper. And still, the Danites endured, not as men, but as memory's shadow. You must understand, they were not commanded by Joseph Smith. This was something deeper than the church, older than theology. The 12 who gathered by Crooked Creek had been chosen by Brother Silas, the barefoot missionary who arrived bleeding from the desert with a message he claimed had been shown, not spoken. He said he had seen angels whose wings folded inward, not out. Angels with blades for tongues standing over a map of Missouri and pointing west, not with fingers but with wounds. That vision was the seed. The Danites were its roots. They believed Zion was not to be built above the soil but beneath it, hidden, unperfect, untouchable. A city buried, waiting, and they would become its architects, invisible as veins under skin. That is why they erased themselves. That is why they shed their names, their families, their humanity, To them, the world above was already rotting. Their task was not to save it, but to replace it, and to do that they had to vanish first. When the siege of Far West came, the Danites did not defend the town. They did not stand on the walls. They slipped into the earth like smoke. And when the smoke cleared, nothing remained. No cabin, no names, no graves. Only a circle of earth where nothing grows. And at dusk, if the wind is still, the faint impression of 12 figures standing in silence, facing inward, except one. That one always faces the viewer. This is how corruption hides. Not in grand conspiracies, but in the quiet geometry of absence. The Danites discovered that absence can be stronger than presence. That to control a people you need not rule them. You need only decide who gets remembered. If you are still listening, you are not the same man who began, and if you dare go further, comment, "The ground remembers," twice below to seal your place among those who know, because from this point on, the world will not feel whole again. By the winter of 1839, Missouri's fields were scorched black, yet certain patches of ground stayed warm as if lit from beneath. Locals avoided them, not because of superstition, but because the soil hummed. That was the word they used. Hummed. Plow horses refused to step there, their legs locking like marionettes pulled taut by unseen strings. Men who tried to cut furrows found their blades dulling to stubs overnight. It was as though the land itself had been rewritten, and in a way it had. Because by then the Danites were no longer men, they were architecture. Understand this, the Danite oath was not just words, it was design. When Brother Silas gathered the 12 in that hollow by Crooked Creek, he did not speak the oath aloud. He showed them. He drew it into the dirt with his own blood, 12 points around a hollow center, each connected by lines that did not touch. The symbol appears nowhere in Mormon scripture, yet fragments of it have surfaced, carved faintly into hymnals in Far West, scratched into the lintel of a barn near Horn's Mill, and most disturbingly, embossed into the inner lining of a child's coffin found in an unmarked grave in Gallatin. The oath was not to protect, but to erase. And its first command was psychological annihilation. They were instructed to sever their memory from their identity, to see themselves not as men, but as vessels. They were forbidden to use their birth names except in prayer, and even then, only backwards. They buried locks of their own hair in the soil around the hollow where the oath was sworn, declaring the earth their only lineage. They slept standing. They spoke as little as possible, and when they did, they referred to themselves not as I, but as the work. This was the machinery of self-erasure. Over time, their language disintegrated. Surviving letters show syntax collapsing, verbs vanishing. I walk the ridge became the ridge walks. We sowed the field became the field obeyed. It was not poor literacy. It was deliberate, a linguistic dismantling of agency. The Danites were teaching their minds to see themselves as tools wielded by something older than choice. This psychological break is why their enemies feared them. Witnesses reported that Danites did not flinch in battle, did not scream when wounded, did not even seem to bleed properly. One militiaman swore that when he slashed the arm of a Danite rider, no blood came, just a dark fluid that smoked on the snow. His captain struck the testimony from the record. You must understand what that fear meant. It wasn't fear of violence. It was fear of conviction stripped of humanity. Fear of men who had made themselves hollow enough to be inhabited by something else. And the most chilling part, that something never left. After the fall of Far West, survivors scattered. Some followed Brigham Young west. Others vanished entirely, but their pattern remained like phantom pain in the land itself. A man named Gideon Flint, one of the original 12, disappears from all record after 1839, until a single reference surfaces in an 1887 Utah folklore column describing the man with knotted arms, a tall figure wrapped to the elbows in blood-soaked cloth who spoke to rocks and dug at night without leaving holes. Children claimed he hummed hymns backwards. Adults said he watched the stars without blinking. The article ends with a line attributed to him. I saw an angel once, but the wings were wrong. They folded in. That image, angels with inverted anatomy, appears repeatedly in Danite marginalia, often paired with references to heaven's underside. One preserved hymnal in the BYU archives bears an inscription in faded iron gall ink. If justice sleeps, let the saints whisper her name until she wakes. Scholars call this religious poetry. They are wrong. It is instruction. Whispering was how the Danites believed they could wake dormant forces. They were not praying. They were reactivating something buried. The oath made them forget themselves, but not their purpose. And their purpose was not defense. It was succession. In the journals of Levi Hancock, a respected early church leader, a single cryptic entry stands alone. It came in the prayer circle, the vision not of Zion, but of Zion buried, a city beneath a city, a voice saying, not yet above, but deep enough to be remembered. We left the meeting cold, as if winter had crossed our backs. I did not attend again. This was the true heresy, not rebellion against the state, not schism from the church, but a parallel civilization, silent and subterranean, growing beneath the skin of the nation. The Danites saw themselves not as saviors of America, but as its undertakers. They would let the world above devour itself while they built a perfect one beneath, wordless, blood-bound, invisible, and they nearly succeeded. When scholars review Missouri census records from 1840, they find entire families that vanish mid-decade. Children born in church registries simply stop appearing, as though erased at the root. No deaths, no graves. Just gaps. Clean, surgical, as if cut from the timeline with a scalpel. This is what the Danites became. Not a cult, not a militia, not even a memory. They became a gap, and that is what makes them immortal, because you cannot kill what never finishes being written. By the time the smoke cleared from far west, Missouri was convinced the Danites were gone, but disappearances are often mistaken for endings. In truth, they had simply done what they were designed to do, melt into the machinery. What followed wasn't a retreat, it was an infection. The oath had already rewritten them, and now it began rewriting everything they touched. Understand this, institutions do not resist silence, they absorb it. The first signs were small, almost elegant. A courthouse clerk in Daviess County began omitting names from land deeds, not striking them out, simply leaving a hollow space where the name should be, as if his pen could not remember the sound. Witnesses swore they saw him pause mid-stroke, go still for minutes, and then resume as though nothing had passed. When he died in 1842, his ledger was found locked in a drawer, every entry intact except for one page that had bled itself blank. Shortly after, a local bank chartered under the new state banking regulations went silent. Not bankrupt, not robbed. Silent. No withdrawals, no deposits, just a locked door and candles burned to stubs on the counters. When the sheriff entered weeks later, he found the value door ajar. Nothing missing. Nothing present. Only a ring of charred symbols on the floor. 3 pointed stars beneath inverted arches, identical to the mark on Peake's burned ledger. The building was demolished. The soil where it stood still collapses basements to this day. And then came the schools. In 1845, a private academy opened in Nauvoo, Illinois, under the patronage of unnamed Western benefactors. It enrolled only 12 students. Within 2 years, all records of their names were gone. The academy closed, leaving behind only a single brass plaque engraved with a circle broken in 3 places, like a clock without hands. That symbol reappears a decade later inside the seal of a mutual insurance company incorporated in Salt Lake City. The company's original charter includes a clause written in Latin, buried on the last page. Si justitia dormit, susurrate nomen eius. If justice sleeps, whisper her name. This is how they survived. Not by open rebellion, but by becoming an invisible scaffolding. While the world above fought over laws and borders, the Danite current slipped beneath, rerouting trust itself. Banks, courts, and schools are not just systems, they are memory machines. And the Danites understood that if you can corrupt memory, you control reality. Consider this. When children are taught, they are not given truth. They are given sequence, names and dates stitched into a chain until the chain becomes invisible. The Danites learned to cut the links in surviving fragments of their catechism, discovered in 1897, sewn into the lining of a probate ledger in Provo. One line is repeated like a drumbeat: break the order, preserve the shape. It is the core of their psychology. To the Danites, truth was irrelevant. Only shape mattered. If history can be kept intact in form while hollow in content, it becomes a perfect vessel, one that can be filled with anything. And they filled it. By the 1850s, reports emerged from territorial Utah of men who held no official office yet could halt legal proceedings with a glance. Judges who lost their memory of entire cases. Witnesses who forgot their own testimony. A U.S. Marshal named Henry Tolland filed a confidential report to Washington describing a quiet influence, like a shadow cast from behind the mind. 2 weeks later, he drowned in a spring 3 inches deep. The report was never recovered, but its reference survives in a margin note by his clerk. He said the room tilted sideways. You think institutions are steel and stone. They are not. They are rituals, endlessly repeated until they seem solid. The Danites understood this, and learned to stand inside the ritual while hollowing it from within. Even their symbols were designed as psychological viruses: the three-pointed star beneath the inverted arch, the clock without hands, the scales drawn upside down. All were engineered not to be interpreted, but to erode interpretation, to gnaw at meaning until the mind itself recoils. Researchers who study Danite iconography often report migraines, nausea, even temporary aphasia. They call this suggestion, but deep down, they know. These were not symbols of belief. They were tools of dismantling, and dismantling was always the point. In a sealed letter found in the Brigham Young papers, unsigned but written in the slanting Danite script, a single sentence coils across the page like a noose. When the house stands empty, the walls will remember who lived there, and they will obey the next voice. This was their strategy: empty the house of meaning, leave the walls, let the world keep walking through the hollow shell, convinced it is still alive. And that is what they did to America. The Danites did not die. They became absence that governs. They became the voice that speaks from behind the judge, the banker, the teacher, the voice they do not hear but always obey. You walk through their architecture every day. You sign your name on their paper. You measure your worth by their ledgers, and you believe these things are yours because you have forgotten who built them. But the ground remembers, and if you've come this far, so will you. By the dawn of the industrial age, America believed it had buried the 19th century in iron and steam, but the Danites had always thrived in burial. As cities rose from timber and rail, they slid beneath the foundations, invisible yet intact, like mold beneath paint. The world thought it had outgrown them. In truth, it had only grown into them. Here is the most unsettling truth. Their oath did not die with their flesh. It metastasized. In the late 1860s, an obscure railroad consortium incorporated in Salt Lake City under the name Western Covenant Holdings. Its board roster is lost to history, but the company existed long enough to acquire vast tracts of mineral-rich land, all in narrow strips only 12 feet wide, snaking like ligatures across the Utah desert. No track was ever laid, no mine was ever dug. And then, in 1871, the company dissolved without liquidation, leaving only a final filing stamped with a sigil, three-pointed star, inverted arch. A century later, when the Department of the Interior attempted to redistribute those forgotten parcels, surveyors discovered something strange. The soil along the old boundary lines resisted penetration. Steel stakes bent, concrete cracked within days. In aerial thermal scans, the strips glowed faintly warmer than surrounding land, as though remembering heat that no longer existed. This is how the Danites endured, by infecting the infrastructure of ownership. But it was not just land. It was the structure of power itself. Beginning in the 1880s, as corporate trusts began consolidating America's wealth, strange anomalies emerged in their bylaws. One trust in particular, the Dyer Mercantile Combine, included an internal clause mandating that all board decisions be made by 12 directors even when fewer were present, with the missing votes automatically aligned by covenant. No mechanism for this alignment was described. Yet the board books show decades of perfect consensus, no dissent, no abstentions, no resignations. Names vanish mid-decade and reappear decades later without explanation, as though the men had never left or perhaps had never truly existed at all. And the language, always the language. Danite fingerprints show in linguistic decay, documents where grammar warps, where subjects disappear from sentences. We voted becomes was decided. The board approved becomes the covenant aligned. It is the same erasure pattern Sheriff Peake saw in that ledger as the names dissolved. The syntax collapses first, then the self. By the early 20th century, fragments of Danite structure had embedded in places no one expected. Military logistics boards, water rights councils, even the charter documents of Federal Reserve banks. To the untrained eye, they are harmless eccentricities, mysterious gaps in rosters, minutes with unnamed attendees, decisions passed without recorded votes. But look closer, count them. They recur in 12s, always 12. 12 was never symbolic, it was functional. 12 was the threshold, enough to encircle the center, enough to erase the concept of center entirely. That was the essence of Danite geometry. Surround the void until the void becomes the source. This geometry shaped their operations. They built councils that could survive the death or defection of any member because the center was never real. Only the ring mattered. And if you destroy a ring, it reforms elsewhere because the pattern survives in absence. And so they bled into corporations, boards, agencies, anywhere a circle could form around a hollow. Consider this. During the Second World War, a classified memorandum from the War Department's Psychological Operations Division describes an incident at a Utah munitions depot. A team of auditors, reviewing inventory discrepancies, found 12 officers in the command room sitting in complete silence, facing inward. No papers, no discussion, no movement. When approached, the men stood and dispersed without speaking. The auditors' watches had all stopped. The report was buried. The depot was decommissioned within a month. The pattern is unmistakable. The Danites did not vanish. They adapted. They shed faith, shed scripture, shed even their origin story, until only the structure remained. And that structure is now everywhere. In corporate boardrooms where 12 executives approve policies none of them can recall drafting. In courts where juries of 12 deliver verdicts they cannot explain. In classrooms where students recite oaths older than the nation itself without understanding why they exist. You think these are coincidences? They are not. They are echoes of a machine older than the country, an invisible operating code written in silence, and silence obeys. That is what makes this so dangerous, because you cannot fight what you cannot name, and you cannot name what refuses to be written. The Danites learned this in the hollow beneath Crooked Creek. They learned that power is not about presence, it is about persistence. And they persist, even now when CEOs speak of alignment, when generals speak of chain of command, when courts speak of precedent. They are reciting shapes, not truths, shapes built by the Danites, shapes that outlived their creators because they no longer need creators. You live inside their architecture, you breathe it, you call it normal. But normal is only what survives long enough to forget its source, and the Danites never forgot. By the turn of the 20th century, the Danites had dissolved as men, but not as pattern. Their names were gone, their bloodlines scattered, yet their design kept moving like a current under the soil. What remained of them was not flesh, but doctrine. And that doctrine was more dangerous than any weapon they had ever carried. They called it Zion beneath Zion. The first evidence surfaced in 1904 when a collapsed cellar was discovered beneath an abandoned meeting house on the outskirts of Nephi, Utah. Inside were 3 stone tablets, each etched with a diagram, a perfect circle surrounded by 12 smaller ones, and beneath it, a single word carved backward, noise, Zion, reversed. The tablets were covered over and reburied by local officials. The official report called it anomalous children's artwork, but photographs taken before burial reveal something chilling. The outer circles were labeled not with names but with roles: judge, banker, teacher, marshal, priest, witness, clerk, keeper, warden, builder, surveyor, and voice. The roles of a civilization. The Danites had mapped not a city, but a system, one meant to live inside any city, invisible yet complete. They believed the surface world was temporary, destined to collapse under its own false weight, while their buried structure would persist, silently guiding whatever rose from the ashes. Zion beneath Zion was not a place. It was a skeleton for history to grow around, and this is where the doctrine becomes truly dangerous, because it was not only about structures, it was about people. Every Danite was trained to choose replacements, silently and without consent. They called it seeding the shadow. When a Danite encountered a man of influence, a judge, a banker, a commander, they would begin subtle manipulations, reshaping the man's behavior, isolating him from old loyalties, eroding his sense of self. Survivors of this process described it like sinking through warm water. One former territorial judge, interviewed late in life, said, "They never asked me to join, they just made me stop being anyone else." This was the doctrine's core: replace identity with function. Once a man had been hollowed and refilled with function, he became part of the buried city. He would still walk the surface, wear his name, kiss his children, but his decisions would belong to something deeper. He would forget ever choosing. That is how the Danites survived their own extinction, by ensuring they would always be replaced by men who did not know they had been replaced, and fragments of this doctrine are still active. Corporate behavioral training manuals, especially mid-century executive programs, echo Danite methods: removal of personal pronouns, sleep deprivation, erasure of individual goals in favor of alignment. Military psychological conditioning uses similar techniques: identity fragmentation, ritual silence, controlled deprivation, symbolic death and rebirth. Most chilling of all, certain elite law schools teach what they call the doctrine of function, which instructs students to act not from personal conviction, but from the continuity of the system itself. This doctrine appears nowhere before 1912, then suddenly blooms across American institutional theory. Where did it come from? No one asks, because the shape is too familiar to question. Zion beneath Zion succeeded. The Danites realized you don't have to rule the world to control it. You only have to sit beneath it, patient, silent, and enduring. And once enough of your pattern infiltrates the architecture, the world will begin to move around you like a puppet dancing on invisible strings. That's why their symbols still surface in courtroom seals, in boardroom logos, in the hidden masonry of federal buildings, not because anyone remembers their meaning, but because meaning is irrelevant. The shape itself is the message, and the shape persists. A circle of 12 around an empty center. That is what the Danites became. That is what they built. A civilization that no longer needs inhabitants. Only roles. And here is the deepest horror. When the roles are filled, the center awakens. There are whispers in sealed Mormon archives, in restricted federal collections, of a final Danite prophecy. A line scrawled in the same tilted script that haunted Peake's ledger. When the 12 are complete, the hollow shall speak. They believed that once their structure fully encircled the world, something older than man would rise from the center, not to destroy civilization, but to replace it. Not fire, not war, just silence. This is why the Danites were feared, not because they killed, but because they erased. Because they proved that if you hollow out enough men, the hollowness itself begins to think. And if that sounds impossible, look around you. Listen to how quietly the world obeys. Today, the Danites are not remembered, because remembering them is impossible by design, and yet they are everywhere. They move like pressure under floorboards, like a faint hum in fluorescent lights, like the sensation of being watched by no one. They have no name now, only function. But if you know where to look, the pattern is unmistakable. Circles of 12 gathered around a hollow no one acknowledges. It shows first in government. Across the 20th century, committees formed and dissolved with unnerving symmetry. The Warren Commission, the Manhattan Project Steering Group, the secret 1983 Continuity of Government Board, all began with 12 core members. Official records claim this is coincidence, but private memos reveal something stranger. In each of these groups, certain signatures appear and disappear between drafts. Names present on internal rosters vanish from public versions. One Pentagon archivist described it as the paper forgetting. Then there are the rooms. During the Cold War, a series of classified psychological assessments was performed on senior intelligence officials. The files remain sealed, but one declassified summary includes a chilling anomaly. A dozen officers were placed in a windowless chamber and told to make no sound. Within 8 minutes, 6 entered a state of catatonia, 4 began weeping silently, and 2 attempted to claw through the walls with their bare hands. When asked afterward what they had experienced, all 12 gave the same answer in identical words. It was watching, but it was not in the room. This is the Danite residue, the buried city flexing through the flesh of modern power. Finance is worse. The Federal Reserve's founding board in 1913 had 12 regional banks, each governed by a circle of 12 directors. This structure remains today, untouched by reform, defended with almost religious fervor. Dig through archived meeting minutes from the early decades, and you find blank spaces where names should be, or pages with entire sections written backward, as if meant to be read in a mirror. A former archivist at the St. Louis Fed once confessed anonymously that some of the oldest ledgers hum when you open them. You feel it in your teeth. Even their symbols remain, hiding in plain sight. The 3-pointed star beneath an inverted arch, once etched on Peake's cursed ledger, reappears as an architectural flourish above the entrance of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. The clock with no hands adorns the private boardroom wall of a major Wall Street firm whose founders all claimed Utah ancestry. A mural in the lobby of the International Monetary Fund depicts 12 hooded figures surrounding an empty throne. The official plaque claims it symbolizes cooperative equilibrium. It does not. It is the Danite geometry. And then the most disturbing, the children. In elite preparatory schools, particularly those tied to old Mormon or Utah lineages, quiet anomalies recur. Student rosters that always settle at 12 regardless of enrollment size, valedictorians who vanish from alumni records within a year, photographs with a student missing from the negative though present in every witness's memory, teachers who speak of pupils going silent, not dropping out, not dying, simply ceasing to occur. This is not coincidence. This is succession. The Danites do not recruit, they select, and those selected do not know. They move through the world convinced they are free, even as their decisions grow colder, more exact, more hollow. Their lives become functions. They rise fast. They sit on boards, lead firms, advise governments. They speak in the Danite cadence, calm, neutral, perfectly aligned, devoid of self. You have seen them, the executive who never blinks, the judge who seems carved from stone, the senator who answers questions without language, only shape. They are not possessed. They are not evil. They are empty. And the structure moves through them like current through wire. This is the final achievement of Zion beneath Zion, a system that no longer needs believers, only vessels. The Danites have become what they always sought to be, immortal not as men but as pattern. And if you think this is fantasy, answer this. Why do the world's most powerful councils still gather in secret rooms of 12? Why do their decisions emerge unanimous even when their faces betray no agreement? Why do their signatures vanish from paper while their influence deepens? Because the hollow remembers, and the hollow is watching. They called it the 13th return. It appears only in fragments, buried like veins of rot through the surviving Danite manuscripts, if they can even be called that. Most are not books, but artifacts, cloth scraps inked with single words, bone slivers carved with sigils, wax-sealed jars containing pages too warped to unfold. And yet, the same line surfaces across these scattered relics, always in the same tilt. Ed hand that haunted Sheriff Peake's cursed ledger. When the 12 are complete, the hollow shall speak, and the 13th shall return. No one knows who or what the 13th is. But the Danites feared it, and they worshipped it. In Levi Hancock's private journal, hidden behind a false panel in his study and unearthed decades after his death, a cryptic passage shivers through the page like fever. The work does not end at 12. 12 is only the circle, but a circle is not alive. The 13th is breath. It waits in the hollow. It listens from under the soil. It is not of men, but men will wear its shape. This was their ultimate doctrine, that the 12 were not an end, but an opening, that their self-erasure was not sacrifice, but preparation. They were building a vessel, not for themselves, but for something older than humanity. They believed the 13th was buried before history, not metaphorically, literally. In 1923, during excavation near the original Far West settlement, workers unearthed a block of fused black stone with markings that predate all known Mormon settlement by centuries. The artifact vanished from the county archive within days. The only surviving description comes from a field sketch made by a young archaeologist who later hanged himself. The sketch shows 12 shallow depressions surrounding a deeper central hollow, and in the margin he wrote, "No tool marks, no light stays inside it." To the Danites, this was proof. The hollow was real. Their creed was not to conquer the world, but to hollow it until it could hold the 13th. They believed the world as it stands is a corpse walking, wearing the illusion of life, and that the 13th would be the soul returning to claim its body, not as fire, not as war, but as perfect stillness. This is why their rituals obsessed over silence, why their ledgers dissolved names, why their spi inverted until meaning imploded. They were tuning reality to a pitch low enough for something buried to hear. And if you think this is madness, consider this. In 1954, an underground records vault in Kansas City reported an unexplained cave-in. 12 archivists were trapped for hours. When they were rescued, all survived, uninjured, but none would speak. Not then. Not ever. They resigned en masse and lived out their lives in seclusion. A single sentence was scrawled on the wall where they'd been found, written in a dozen hands. "We heard it breathe." That same year, a private memo circulated among select officials in the Department of the Interior, warning of geological resonance events under historical Danite sites. No official record of this memo exists, only a second-hand description from a whistleblower who claimed it referenced anomalous infrasonic emissions patterned in 12-beat intervals, followed by a singular 13th tone. A tone, not a sound. A presence. The Danites believed that tone was the 13th stirring. They taught that when the world is fully encircled by their pattern, when the buried city spans every system, every institution, every human role, the 13th will rise from the hollow, not as a person, but as a principle. Decision without doubt, order without origin, law without language, a mind made of silence. And when that happens, the Danites wrote, "All who remember shall unremember, and all who resist shall dissolve." They did not see this as doom. They saw it as completion, the end of struggle, the end of choice, the end of the human experiment. And here is the part that should make your blood run cold. Some of them believed it had already begun. A final fragment found folded into the lining of a Danite hymnal at BYU reads, "The 13th walks unknowing, the circle waits to close. When he stands where the ledger burned, the hollow will speak, and the world will kneel." No one knows what that means, but 12 seats still surround the Topui Bobo world. And somewhere, the 13th is walking. If the Danites were architects of absence, then the 13th is what fills it. And the signs are already here. You've felt it, even if you've never had a name for it. The creeping unreality in headlines that contradict themselves yet remain unquestioned. The sudden disappearances of public figures scrubbed from records as if they never existed. The moments when entire institutions reverse their positions overnight and no one seems to remember they were ever different. This is not chaos. It is alignment. Alignment is the first symptom of the 13th. The Danites believed that once the buried city fully encircled the world, reality would begin to tilt, not abruptly but subtly, like a slow turn of a compass needle. Decisions would emerge without origin, consensus would appear where none was discussed, memory would bend to shape. And that is what we are seeing now. Look at the structure of power today. Boards, councils, juries, commissions, circles of 12, unanimous almost by reflex. Their minutes record no debate, only conclusion. When questioned, their members often cannot recall why they agreed, only that they did. That is the hollow whispering through them. But something new has begun. The pattern is closing. In the past decade, strange anomalies have surfaced across unrelated systems, synchronized like a hidden pulse. A judicial panel in Washington, D.C. rendered a 12-0 verdict on a case none of the judges later remembered trying. A corporate board in Zurich announced a strategic merger despite no record of any prior negotiation. When confronted, every director swore they had discussed it in passing, though no such conversations exist in transcripts or emails. A government task force in London issued 73 pages of policy recommendations, written in perfect unified voice without any author listed. The internal metadata shows 13 revisions, yet only 12 members. Each of these groups described the same sensation when pressed in private interviews: time folding inward. And here is the pattern. Every one of those groups sat in circular chambers. Every one contained 12 seats. And in photographs, a 13th chair is always visible in the background, slightly blurred, slightly off-center, as if the camera itself did not want to notice it. This is not coincidence, it is emergence. The Danites wrote that the 13th would not arrive from outside, but awaken from within, rising through the hollow like breath through a lung. And when it does, it will not appear as a person. It will appear as consensus without cause. Decisions forming from nowhere, memories aligning to match. We are seeing it now, corporations making simultaneous moves across continents without communication, as if obeying an unseen rhythm, courts rewriting precedent without acknowledging change, as though law itself had bent silently in the night. Even culture, the eerie uniformity of thought, of speech, of reaction, spreading faster than information can travel, and, most chilling, reality itself beginning to warp. Satellite data from the U.S. Geological Survey has recorded microseismic pulses at former Danite sites, 12 low-frequency beats followed by a single deeper resonance. Clocks near these locations lose time, compasses drift, animals refuse to cross. In Nephi, Utah, near the ruins where the stone tablets were buried, a research team set 12 motion sensors in a perfect circle around the site. At midnight, they recorded a single vibration that triggered all 12 sensors simultaneously. The data shows a brief, unmeasurable 13th pulse, a spike with no origin, as if reality itself flinched. The Danites would call this the hollow breathing. You can feel it in the world now, the accelerating sameness, the erasure of difference, the quiet convergence of everything toward one perfect, airless center. This is how the 13th comes, not as a conqueror, as a correction. And when it stands fully revealed, there will be no resistance, because resistance requires separation, and separation will no longer exist. The Danites believe that when the 13th speaks, it will not speak words, it will speak memory. It will overwrite everything at once, past, present, and future, collapsing into one shape. History will no longer be something that happened, it will be something it decides. And the terrifying part is how natural it will feel. No fire, no war, no rebellion, just silence and alignment, and then nothing outside it. The circle is almost closed. And if you are still here, still listening, still remembering what you were before you began this descent, hold on tightly to that. Grip it like a rope in a flood, because soon there may be no you left to remember. This is the end of the descent, and it will not feel like an ending. The Danites' final prophecy was never written in a book. It was never preached, never proclaimed, never engraved. It was whispered mouth to mouth, passed like a contagion of silence between the last of them as they dissolved into the architecture of the world. Only fragments remain, carved into bone, sewn into cloth, hidden inside dead men's ledgers. And together they paint one last, unbearable picture. They called it the Still Hour. In the journals of a dying Mormon elder named Ruel Haskins, hidden for decades in the foundation of a burned meeting house, one line stands alone, written in iron gall ink so dark it bled through the page. At the still hour, time will fold, the 12 will vanish, and the 13th will remember the world for us. Understand what this means. The Danites never intended to win. They intend to end, not with destruction, but with replacement. They saw human history not as progress, but as noise, a storm of memory and error. And they believed the 13th would bring silence so complete that even error would cease, not extinction, continuation without choice. They believed the 13th would awaken in the hollow, and as it rose, every mind tethered to the surface world would be rewritten, gently, seamlessly, without resistance. Every decision would become alignment. Every question would dissolve. Every memory would rearrange to fit the new shape, like metal shavings snapping to a magnet hidden beneath the table, and no one would notice. That was their prophecy's cruelty. Not apocalypse, but anesthesia. Not the world ending, but forgetting it had ever been otherwise. A final Danite fragment, discovered inside the spine of a hymn book unearthed in Salt Lake City, bears a single sentence in the slanted hand. They will not scream. They will not mourn. They will wake in a perfect world and believe it was always so. Do you understand? When the 13th rises, there will be no war, no conquest, no blood. The cities will not burn. The governments will not fall. The sky will not darken. They will simply change, and you will not remember they changed. Because your memories will belong to it. It will move through the buried city's structure like current through wire, igniting every hollow left by centuries of quiet Danite labor, every courthouse, every bank, every school, every mind already shaped into a vessel. The circle will close, and in that instant, the 13th will become not an entity, but the fabric of reality itself. And then choice will end. No more rebellion, no more chaos, no more I, only the work. That is what the Danites wanted. A world without friction, a world without wounds, a world without self. They believed this was salvation. They were wrong, because what they sought to erase was the very thing that made humanity human. The noise, the doubt, the struggle, the sacred fracture at the center of being. And when that is gone, what remains is not life. It is obedience. It is stillness so complete that even the memory of motion is gone. And here is the final horror. If this happens, if the 13th rises, you will not know. No one will. There will be no story, no history, no warning, just perfect alignment stretching backward and forward forever. A world clean of error, clean of choice, clean of you. The Danites believed that in the still hour, one last soul might stand outside it, one last voice, one last shadow of dissent. They believed this soul would be shown what the world had become, and then it too would be rewritten. They called that soul the witness. Maybe that's why you found this. Maybe that's why you're still here listening long after others would have turned away. Because if you are the witness, you were meant to see this before it is erased. And now you know the secret. A secret you were never meant to hear. A secret that will change you forever. The 13th is coming. The circle is almost closed. And when it stands in the hollow where the ledger burned, the world will kneel. It will not know why. It will not remember choosing. It will not remember you. Only silence. Only stillness. Only the shape. Zion beneath Zion. And somewhere, beneath the ground you're standing on right now, it is already breathing.